welcome to Need to Know, your weekly investment podcast brought to you by the experts at Coutts. I'm Sarah Muir and I'm joined as always by David Broomfield. Apologies, we've had a little bit of a hiatus for Need to Know, but we're back. And David, I know you wanted to talk about the general frenzy surrounding AI, but perhaps from a slightly different perspective. Is that right?
Yes, Sarah. And hi, everyone. I do want to talk about AI, partly because I'm a budding sort of amateur physicist. I think it's the career I should have had instead of working in finance. And I think there's a really interesting story away from the big chip mania that has consumed the market over the last year or so. And it's about the bigger world that needs to support AI. If all of these productivity boosts that we've been promised need to come true, well, other things need to happen as well.
Yeah. Okay, that sounds good. So how are we going to divide that then into our three sort of topics?
Yeah, so I was thinking about this. So you're going to have to indulge me, I think, for my first topic. So we'll talk a bit about the physics, and it's not really the physics. It's more about the power needs, the power demand, the power consumption that's needed to support this new world of AI. Mm-hmm. And I think then the second point, which flows from that, is that if we need to deliver a lot more power, well, how are we going to do that without pushing lots of carbon into the atmosphere?
Yeah.
And then the third point, I think, is to talk a bit about, well, it's not just about power. There's a whole world that orbits around AI that needs to invest a lot of money and a lot of resource over the coming years to make all of this come true. So we'll talk a bit about the ecosystem.
Okay, sounds good. All right, then let's kick off with the science then. Don't switch off, anyone listening to this. I promise you, this is going to be really interesting. Go on then. So the physics associated with AI and how that's going to impact its successful rollout.
Yeah, well, I think this is to me the most interesting thing. So it's a topic which never comes up at dinner parties about electricity generation. I mean, everyone will talk about sustainability and the need to decarbonize and the energy transition, but the actual numbers of how much do we produce, how much do we consume, and what's the trend been over the last decade and a half? And I think this is really interesting. So first of all, let's talk about, well, what's actually needed to make AI happen. So first of all, these AI racks that existing data centers consume anywhere between 6 to 10 times more power than a traditional data center stack. Okay, so they are way more energy intensive. So there's the energy that you need to invest to train these AI models. That is not insignificant. They're basically supercomputers that gobble loads of power. But then once you've trained them, you actually have to stick them in data set parts of the infrastructure. Parts of the AI infrastructure need to be housed in data centers, and those data centers use 6 to 10 times more energy than a traditional data center. So there's some great data out there from the International Energy Association, and they estimate by 2027 there's going to be about 1.5 million servers around the world running at full capacity, consuming an extra 85.4 terawatt hours of electricity. Okay, so what does that mean? That's just a very large number.
I was just going to say, I saw a figure that apparently ChatGPT requires 2.9 watt hours to answer a question, which is 10 times the energy required for a Google search.
Exactly. AI-powered search, which is what certain companies like Perplexity are embedding, and obviously Google are embedding, is way more energy intensive per search query. But this extra, this 85.4 terawatt hours of electricity, that's equivalent to the power needs of a country like the Netherlands or Argentina. Right? It's huge. It's absolutely huge. And again, so let's think, well, okay, how are we going to meet that? How are we going to meet that demand? Well, again, let's put this into perspective. One nuclear power plant, on average, produces about 1 gigawatt. So over a year, if you include the downtime and servicing and the other mechanics of running a nuclear power plant, you produce about 8,000 gigawatt hours of energy. Okay. Let me relate this back to that number. Okay, a terawatt is 1,000 gigawatts. So basically, to generate that 85.4 terawatt hours, you need to build about 100 nuclear power plants. Or if you do the same thing for wind turbines, you need to produce about 14,000 wind turbines just to meet that incremental power demand. And, if you took all of these AI data centers that are going to be built and run, and you turned it into a country, that country would be probably a top 10 power producer consumer in the world.
I've seen examples of like Japan or Germany. It would be the equivalent of something like that.
Yeah, it's huge. And there's some quite a few variations in the estimates for how big it will be, but you can't escape that 6 to 10 times greater energy intensity. So how does that relate back to, well, how we've produced power over the last 10 to 15 years? And this is where I think it gets really interesting. So first of all, power consumption in the US has pretty much gone sideways for 10 years. Okay, so it's grown by basically 0%. Actually, a bit longer than 10 years, since the financial crisis. It's grown by basically 0%. And in Europe, it's actually declined by 10% since 2008.
Why is that?
Well, it's really interesting. So some of that is the idiosyncratic shocks of the recent war and the impact on German industry. But also you've got two things happening. You've got sort of the decline of heavy industry. You've also got efficiency gains, because technology is getting more efficient. And as we get on to where this is leading, one of the reasons why power demand has gone sideways, even though we've been using way more cloud data storage and more clock cycles, is that there has been an inherent efficiency gain in the technology. But the story here is that efficiency gain, that's coming to an end. So I think that, and let me just bring that to life. So between 2015 and 2019, demand for data centers tripled. This was before the AI crisis, so we're already using more data centers anyway. But the efficiency of those data centers, because they got bigger, because the technology got better, the efficiency got better. So step back, the trend has been power demand going sideways in the US, power demand decreasing in Europe. And for the first time in about 15 years, we're going to have to get serious, I think, about power generation, power capacity. We can't just rely on renewables. And why do I say that? Because renewables create intermittent power supply, right? The wind blows, supply peaks, the sun shines, supply peaks, and obviously the inverse is true. Last I checked, Google was a 24-hour service. You can't just have it on when the wind blows and when the sun shines. So how we generate this power is going to be quite important, I think.
I know that Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, has said that an energy breakthrough is needed to power AI. And he's actually one of the people who's investing. We're going to talk about this. I know a US fusion power startup, and that maybe is the answer. Maybe AI can come up with the answer.
Yeah, I mean, fusion is the holy grail, isn't it? I mean, it's certainly since I've been in this industry a couple of decades, there's always been a company that's on the verge of nuclear fusion. I think there's a joke, isn't there, amongst physicists, that nuclear fusion is only ever 10 years away. And there's two scientific, for those that are interested, that are listening to the podcast, you can read about the two most viable ways of nuclear fusion. One is using lasers to, implode a little bit of tritium, and that's called inertial confinement fusion. And then you've got tokamak reactors, these huge magnets that confine plasma into very tight, hot bundles. But, we're a long way from that saving us here. In the short term, we've just got to build more capacity on the existing grid.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So what we're saying at the moment then is the AI kind of revolution, because I think Elon Musk said that last year the constraint on AI was chips. This year, it seems like what a lot of key people in this industry are saying is we don't have enough energy.
Yeah, exactly. So we need to, the estimates vary, but you're seeing probably a doubling in the power demand growth through to 2030 from 2022 levels. Remember, it's been 0% over the last decade, and it's rising now 1.7. It's probably going to go to 2.4. And then further north of that to probably 3+ if you look at some of the investment bank research on this area. So I think you've got this big just physics problem that you've got to generate more power. And that kind of leads me to my second point. Well, what are we going to do? Like, are we just going to burn more coal, burn more gas? And remember what I said, you can't rely on renewables wholly because of this intermittency point. So today we generate, well, I say we, the world is roughly 60-40, let's say fossil fuels to renewables. When you look at where these data centers are housed and you look at what power they consume, it's a roughly 60-40 mix. I think the big question out there is how much of, in the short term, is the 60, so the fossil fuels, going to have to increase to meet this demand? China is actually, it's leading the world, as you know. They've got a state-directed program to just invest massively in renewable energy and power infrastructure generally. I mean, the China perspective on this is just utterly astonishing. They're going to install twice the solar capacity than the US in the next year. I mean, it's just, the numbers are just absolutely enormous. They're probably going to generate another 423 terawatts of power. That's equal to the total electricity consumption of France over the next year. So China's anticipating this, not just about AI, just its broad need to generate more power and in a sustainable way. I think we are only just coming to the realization here that we need to generate more power and in a sustainable way. It's a big conundrum.
Yeah, okay. Because as you say, the renewable sources are great, but they're intermittent, and data centers need a consistent, reliable source of energy. I know that some of the big tech buyers or big tech players are investing in renewable energy. I think Microsoft have just got involved with company called Brookfield, if I remember, or Brookfield Asset Management. They're looking at that. And again, I come back to my slightly flippant point at the beginning, is can't AI find a solution for this? Because I did read that I think it was Google managed to reduce energy use for cooling by 40% at one of its data centers by using its DeepMind machine learning to forecast variables like demand and weather. And actually, it's not just energy, is it? It's water as well that's super important for this process.
Yeah. I mean, these data centers release a huge amount of heat. In fact, there's some great innovation in Scandinavia and in Sweden using the waste heat from data centers to actually heat homes and offices within cities. So there are innovative ways you can be more efficient, and you're absolutely right that AI is one solution to this problem, but it's not going to solve everything. So if you look at the immediate applications of AI in improving efficiencies, yes, grid management, power, data center power management, also more esoteric applications to enhance agricultural yields, waste reduction, efficiencies in healthcare. And once you put all of these efficiencies together and net them off, yes, it does reduce the demand for power. You can be more intelligent and more efficient, but you can't escape the raw supply side problem, which you just need to generate more. And I think it's that, to me, is the big policy issue to tackle, like building more power capacity. But then if you speak anecdotally, and this kind of goes on to my third point, like if you speak anecdotally to people who are involved in data centers, involved in the grid, they say actually you can't even if there might be power in the system somewhere where some of these data centers are planned to be built or where they want to be built, you can't actually hook into the grid because either the power company can't manage the load, or actually getting the access to the kilowatts you need, then the interconnectors remains a huge challenge. And this kind of relates to the broader ecosystem. It's not just about the power plant. It's about actually, proverbially speaking, plugging into the grid and then managing that infrastructure.
Because I know that Ireland have said, I think, because Ireland is, I think Virginia is the big location in the US for data centers. Yeah. Ireland's also a popular location. But I believe now they're saying that they will not allow the opening of any new data centers unless those data centers are able to provide their own energy in an emergency. So they're not able to support them. Exactly.
And this I think is the big story. So there needs to be, I think, a coordinated response to if we're going to run all of these AI platforms that we think we're going to run. You want to start seeing some of this investment happening very soon, because the lead time on building, power plant's the most extreme example. The lead time on building a new power plant is very long. planning, consultation, and then the actual execution of the project takes, in some cases, in the case of nuclear power, a decade and a half. But even wind turbines aren't without their challenges. And then, like you said, it's about not just building it, it's about building it close enough to the actual data center. So everyone right now is focused on chip makers. Like you said, that has been the bottleneck. But I think, should we talk about that ecosystem that helps data centers plug into the grid and support what is termed as grid resiliency? So basically, when I looked at this, you can kind of split the companies involved. You go up and down the supply chain and you look at data centers, you look at the technology that obviously gets put in data centers, and then the various people around that help connect data centers to ultimately consumers or the grid. You can split it into kind of 4 buckets. You've got how the data center actually runs, and that's what they refer to as compute and memory. So that's the actual raw processing power. And that's the story that everyone has been enjoying over the last year. That's NVIDIA, that's Intel, that's the chips. Then you've got the other 3 components that are less reported. Networking and connectivity, that's connecting the data centers together. Companies like Cisco is your classic example there. Then you've got infrastructure, people that actually provide that liquid cooling that you mentioned, the electrical maintenance. These things, they don't just get set up and you walk away. You have to maintain them every day. And then you've got servers and storage. So you've actually got a slightly separate infrastructure that's about data storage, and that's companies like Seagate and perhaps even Dell. So it's a complex system, and it's one that I think when we go back right to the beginning of the podcast, when we talk about the AI revolution, if we're going to see the productivity gains being promised, we need obviously to roll this out in a practical application. To do that requires a lot more data centers, but you're not going to see companies grow into those valuations until we actually get cash flow from these projects. To get cash flow from these projects, you have to actually build physical infrastructure.
Okay, so we're saying then that I suppose we're sort of tempering the current AI frenzy with, this is great, and this could change productivity and improve productivity. However, there are a number of elements that need to be in place for that to happen. And those things, are not in place at the moment, perhaps entirely, and don't happen overnight. That we're talking about a lead time of maybe 10 plus years, or slightly shorter, perhaps, about 5 or 6 years plus.
Yeah, I mean, it comes back to that second point about there are always ways to very quickly generate more power in the system. Okay, so you can, in the short term, but by the way, those ways aren't generally pretty. Right? As we experienced in the very cold winter of 2022, you can, when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, to always generate more power, but it's carbon intensive. So how that, the reporting on this topic, I think, will become more intense as people realize that in the short term, to generate excess power supply, you've got to burn fossil fuels, or we have to lengthen, the timeline for implementation here and the realization of the productivity gains, because it means, building battery storage, grid resiliency, renewables, and or even maybe nuclear power. I'm not sure. And that takes a lot longer.
I guess what's interesting is that one of the concerns about the Magnificent Seven is that we've seen very concentrated growth in a very small sector in the global economy. But what you're talking about then suggests that this is actually going to widen out much more, that there are going to be much more opportunities for other sectors to come in, because they're all going to be an important part of the success of AI.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, as you know, regular listeners to this podcast will know none of what we discuss here is investment recommendations or advice. No. But if you look at how the various sectors in the take the US index as an example, as the S&P as an example, you've obviously seen now the AI frenzy slightly come off its boil, and you've seen recently some quite strong performance in utilities. Okay, quite a lot of that is about where we are in the rate cycle. And this is, again, another interesting point, which is that utility companies generally carry quite a lot of debt. And that debt obviously gets influenced by floating rates, and as rates rise, obviously utility companies have to service ever increasing amounts of debt. Just at a point where we're asking utility companies to invest more. So recently you've seen utilities be quite strong. A lot of that's to do with the rate cycle, but I think, you know, without going into the specific components of those three other parts of the ecosystem that I mentioned, you're going to have to see a lot more investment by those firms, and potentially it's going to be more lucrative for them if, you know, more data centers are built and more connectivity needs to be installed. So I think that there's going to be some quite interesting stories about investment in power coming out over the next year.
Yeah, and who knows? Maybe we'll finally get to the holy grail of nuclear fusion that actually generates more power than it requires to generate the power in the first place. Who knew nuclear fusion was going to be the next dinner party topic? Dinner party topic, I should say. That'll be one to listen out for. And as we've talked about a couple of companies today, we've mentioned some company names, and obviously we've mentioned some sectors. Not investment advice. A reminder that the views expressed in this podcast are not intended to constitute investment advice, are accurate at the time of recording, and are subject to change. Thank you very much, David, for joining me today. Thank you for listening, for your comments, suggestions, and feedback. We'll be back next week with more Need to Know, when we'll be joined by Monique Wong and Catherine O'Shea, and we're going to look at the London prime property market. Interesting, as there's been a couple of really, really big deals in the super prime property market that have gone through recently. So it'll be interesting to get their thoughts on that. Until then, bye for now.